May 18, 1944. A cold, damp dawn pressed against the windows of a converted farmhouse outside Berry Street, Edmonds, Suffolk. The house, inconspicuous in the morning haze, breathed with the low mechanical heartbeat of generators and the thin, endless hiss of radio static. Inside, in a single-storied room that smelled of oil, tobacco and stale coffee, a bank of wireless sets and typewriters glowed and clattered like a small, obedient machine. Men in mismatched uniforms, khaki, olive drab, a scattering of British battle dress and American OD, moved with careful, rehearsed hurry. They were not a single regiment, they were an entire illusion. Corporal Thomas Reed, 26, nicknamed Tommy by the men who trusted him and the Phantom by half the staff who didn't understand his trade, sat hunched over a mahogany table that was a surgeon's bench for radios. He was a radio operator by trade and a conjurer by necessity. On the table lay his tools, the radio headset with its cracked leather, a brass Morse key polished by 1,000 taps, coil spools, a notebook fat with call signs, and a cigarette stub in a tin ashtray. Across from him, wires snaked into a wireless set number 19 bolted to a crate. A long, telegraph-like antenna mast disappeared through a skylight and into the chilled sky. The set breathed and coughed out static. Reed's gloved fingers hovered above the Morse key, but the traffic he would generate that morning would not be mere dots and dashes. It had to be the voice of an army that did not exist. 2 rooms away, Major Arthur Langley, a gray-eyed MI5 liaison with neat cuffs and a clipped, impatient voice, studied a map pinned to a board. On the map, the eastern English coast glowed with names, Felixstowe, Harwich, and further down, the beaches the real invasion might yet choose. But pinned alongside those real places were false pins, a phantom geography of camps, depots and motor pools, an entire First United States Army group, commanded from the shore by the most plausible man London could conjure, General George S. Patton. Remember, Langley said when he came in to check Reed, their listening sets are hungry men. They'll notice what's missing, the pauses, the wrong cadence, the wrong net discipline. You are not just an operator, you are a troop of operators. You will feed them a life. Reed nodded without looking up. He understood that his work lived in the spaces between real soldiers and dead wires. He had been trained to mimic the nervous habits of tired men, the half-words, the slips of jargon, the way a tired sergeant would abbreviate a grid reference. In his notebook, beside each unit's call sign, he wrote little personality cues. Sergeant Hargreaves, impatient, uses Roger that a lot. 1st Armored Recon, likes to use full grid twice. The cues were theatrical notes for voices only the air would hear. Outside the farmhouse, the deception campaign known to some in London as Operation Fortitude had become 1,000 small operations stitched together. Inflatable tanks and mock landing craft occupied muddy fields elsewhere. A paper trail of phony orders and unit diaries circulated through channels engineered to be seen. Double agents fed carefully calibrated lies to German intelligence. But the beating heart of the lie, the part that would convince enemy signals intelligence that entire corps were moving and training across East Anglia, was a tiny team of wireless men who could make the radio waves smell like gasoline and groan like tracks over hard road. Reed's team, a dozen men and a scattering of women wireless operators from the Auxiliary Territorial Service, were a peculiar corps. They called themselves the Special Wireless Section, in jokes, and the Ghost Net, in private notes. Each man had learned to inhabit more than his own name. 1 hour he might become a captain from a fictional armored brigade, the next he would be a logistics NCO for a made-up artillery formation. They practiced voices until their throats bled with imitation. They catalogued slang and unit habits like naturalists catalog birds. Their orders came from the London controlling section through ciphered communiques and meticulous schedules. Colonel John Bevan, the real architect of the larger Fortitude plan, did not visit Suffolk, but his fingerprints were on the cadence of every carefully timed transmission. The schedule Reed read that morning read like a theater cue sheet: 0600 to 0745, routine command nets for 1st Armored Division, fictitious, simulated fuel requests, maintenance reports. 0800 to 0930, recon patrols, short bursts of transmissions with directional chatter. 1000 to 1700, cornet, heavy volume to suggest brigade movements and administrative busywork. Night, low-level, training transmissions, and false emergency chatter. Keep it busy, Langley told Reed. Not too clean. An army doesn't send neat, punctilious traffic into a net all day. They curse. They repeat grid refs. They talk about the weather and send corrections for rations. And when it rains, mention mud. The Germans must hear soldiers, not scripts. Reed's first transmission that morning was simple, an acknowledgement to an imaginary company commander, a voice that began with a clipped American accent he had been practicing for weeks. He breathed into the microphone, and his voice went out, small and sure into the static. Fusag Command to 3rd Armored, acknowledge receipt of convoy ETA 1400. Over. On the other end, the far end that would not reply because there was no actual armored column, the air swallowed the call. Reed did not pause. He initiated a cascade, a chain of short, realistic exchanges that imitated supply requests. Fuel type. Number of vehicles. Tire pressure reports. The wireless room filled with the illusion of movement. In a different corner of the farm, another operator keyed up and imitated a mechanic on a repair net, complaining about a stuck breech on a Sherman mock-up. The Germans would not know whether Shermans were present, but the mention of a common Allied tank type sounded more plausible than not. These transmissions were not random. They were intelligence theater. Each phrase was designed to feed enemy signals analysts not only content but pattern. The German High Command, the Abwehr and Luftwaffe signals outfits, had been cataloging Allied calling signs, net structures, and traffic volumes for years. To convince them that a whole army was concentrated in East Anglia, the Ghost Net had to replicate the statistical footprint of an army, call signs appearing across nets, predictable burst lengths, recurring times of transmission, and the occasional human slip that made signals seem authentic. There were rules: always use net discipline when necessary, when simulating a fatigued company, introduce punctuation errors, if an operator pretends to be a soldier returning from leave, let him mention hometown football scores. But never, ever repeat the exact same message every day. Repetition would become a fingerprint. The art was to make the lie look messy, to be believable by being convincingly human. The technical challenge was as heavy as the theatrical one. The wireless set number 19 was a robust piece of kit, designed for tanks and command vehicles, but it was not built for a deception campaign that required dozens of simulated nets. Reed and his team had to manage frequencies so that their transmissions would appear to originate from different places across East Anglia. They used direction-finding evasion techniques, physically moving masts, altering signal power and antenna angles to simulate different locations. Sometimes they sent the same message from two different sets, slightly delayed, to create the illusion of a convoy moving along a road. They had to sound convincingly localized. The difference between 3 to 4 kilometers east of grid XY and 3 to 4 east of grid XY was small, but one variation lent the sense of a hurried NCO correcting himself, making the scene authentic. At midday, a courier arrived with a sheaf of typewritten orders that had been planted to the local press and slipped into the hands of certain reconnaissance brigades who would show up in German reports. The notebooks, the diaries, even the cigarette butts scattered intentionally where enemy agents might find them were part of the broad stage. But it was the radio waves that crossed the English Channel and landed in German receivers, translated into reports that a single operator could not only write but shape. By afternoon, Reed's throat had gone raw. He had been the voice of 3 different brigades, a supply column and a phantom field hospital. His notebook now held dozens of call signs and invented nicknames. He paused between transmissions to sip coffee that had gone cold and to glance at the field through the frosty window. In the muddy grounds beyond the farmhouse, inflated canvas tanks lay in neat rows, mock armor that would look like presents from the air on a clear day. Nearby, young men in canvas uniforms rehearsed the cues for what they were: bodies meant to emit the shadow of an army on reconnaissance photos. But it was Reed's sound that would give them names. At 1800 hours, as dusk bled across the horizon, a small contingent of signals officers gathered to listen to the evening's exercise. They sat in a semicircle around a loudspeaker that piped in parts of the day's traffic. Bevan's directives had emphasized not just quantity but verisimilitude. The work must be so convincing that German intelligence would pin a commander's profile on it, and what better commander than Patton? The idea had been planted in German minds earlier by double agents and press leaks. Now radio would build the rest of the narrative. "Listen to this," Langley said softly, pointing to a clip. The loudspeaker filled the room with a breathy, fatigued baritone speaking in a careful American. "Tell the supply lads to hold the second convoy by grid T-72. Repeat, hold convoy, we are rerouting to the south of the estuary. Gas consumption estimates, 150 gallons per vehicle per week. Confirm." There it was, detail enough to be actionable. Reed had learned to lace his scripts with logistic specificity, the small, ordinary facts that made a fictitious formation become believable to those who could read numbers. An enemy listening post would not hear a commander's medal list or philosophic soliloquy. They would hear numbers, times, irritated NCOs, and habit. Those were the things that decorated truth. Not every day was a triumph. On May 22 Reed remembered a freckled corporal in a Luftwaffe listening post picking up one of their nets and noting the wrong regional slang, an Americanism where a Britishism would have fitted. The report had come the next morning in a briefing, anomalous accent observed. Intelligence reports suggest increased scrutiny. A warning like that was a knife edge. It told them that foreign ears were not only listening, they were listening critically. Langley ordered a tonal correction the next day. Reed was taken to a small room where an American-born linguist instructed him on cadence, on how a Midwestern inflection would round certain vowels, on the habitual, you know, that an exhausted GI might use. Reed practiced until his jaw ached. He learned to say gasoline the American way and to throw in the occasional colloquialism without overdoing it. If the Germans had spies in cafes comparing accents, then the operator who spoke for an entire army would need to sound like a man who grew up with baseball in his bones. But beyond accent lay riskier ground, counterintelligence measures that could expose the whole operation. The Germans had direction-finding vans that could triangulate a transmission's origin and thus expose a phony concentration of forces. To counter that, Reed and his fellows developed a choreography. The same net would be transmitted from different masts at different times, messages would be relayed by low-power sets to suggest proximity. Occasionally, a transmission would be purposefully intercepted by a collaborator set placed miles away and then resent in a delayed echo. The net produced a scatter of bearings that resembled movement rather than a single fixed point. On May 31, a slip nearly undid them. Reed had been tasked to transmit a long, involved order for a mock rehearsal of beach landings. He was tired. He mistimed the call sign, and the interfering pattern that normally masked his originating mast was late. For a breathless minute his transmission read almost like a fingerprint. The Fletcher station, an analytical post monitoring traffic red flags, lit up with alerts. Men in gray coats gathered and argued about whether the Germans had noticed a fixed signal pattern. A plan was enacted to move the mast 2 miles west and to retransmit the same message as if the column had been rerouted. Reed swallowed the fear and the chew of a cigarette, and they executed the trick like actors changing the scene while the show went on. It was not only nerves and technique that kept the deception alive, it was also ritual. Every night before the last scheduled transmission, the wireless operators would stand in a small circle, palms clenched, and perform a small, private observance that Reed described later as the math of faith. They would check code sheets, fold them ceremonially, and place a matchbook on top, a superstitious token for luck and for the small human hope that their artifice would hold when it mattered. Because the far consequence of their daily work was the future of thousands, the actual invasion of Normandy. If the Germans believed their radio smoke, if German High Command could be convinced that the threat lay heavily on the Pas-de-Calais because an entire phantom army loomed in East Anglia, then the real assault on the Normandy beaches would find fewer defenders. Reed's tiny, repetitive transmissions were a piece of that leverage. They were the noise that would misplace divisions, the chatter that would bind decision-makers to the wrong maps. As May slid into early June, the tempo accelerated. Reed's role moved from daily theater to final, decisive orchestration. The Ghost Net now had to simulate an army preparing for immediate assault, convoys that sounded like they were packing, chatter suggesting naval liaison, frantic supply checks, the characteristic terse reports from aerial reconnaissance. Each piece of traffic was time-stamped to produce a credible build-up, more nets, more traffic, more mistakes, plausibility by density. On the night of June 3, the farmhouse thrummed with a tension Reed had not felt before. The men moved like a crew about to launch a long voyage. The generator's steady throb was a kind of countdown. Langley and his officers circulated with grave faces. Reed tightened his headset straps until they bit his ears. For the first time in weeks, the operation would not simply suggest an army, it would mimic the last scrambling, human hour before a crossing. He keyed up and sent out a message that was small and human, a junior officer asking for a roster check, a mention of bad weather reports over the channel, and an offhand remark about a sergeant's sore foot. In the top brasses planning rooms across the channel, the same kinds of messages would be annotated and cross-checked. To the German ears listening from a dark room with a cup of coffee and a cigarette, it would be one more brick in a wall of belief. Reed thought then of the men in Normandy, the ones he had never met and perhaps would never meet. He let himself imagine a beachhead where fewer defenders waited because an entire enemy staff had been coaxed away by the sound of ghosts. It was a heavy, private hope. When the first distant boom of bombardment rippled across the continent, the real invasion would come days later. Reed's last recorded transmissions for Fortitude would already have been carved into German intelligence logs. His nights of mimicry and the acre of rubber tanks outside the farmhouse were meant to give commanders in far-off rooms false confidence in their plans, to keep reserves anchored where they could not be used. That night, as Reed took off his headset and felt the rawness of his voice, Langley tapped his shoulder and said nothing. They both understood what had been at stake. Not only the survival of a campaign of illusions but the fate of real soldiers on real beaches. Reed walked outside to stand next to the inflated tanks that rippled in a gentle wind. The moon turned the canvas a ghostly silver. He placed his hand on one of the mock treads as if greeting an old friend. In a week, the men in East Anglia would still be at their posts, feeding the nets with messages that doubled the suggestion of force. Somewhere across the channel, German analytic reports would begin to solidify a narrative of massing strength in the Pas-de-Calais. A single operator in a farmhouse could not win a war. But as the night sighed and the radio room cooled, Reed felt something like the weight of responsibility, the uncomfortable pride of a craftsman whose falsehood had to be perfect to save truth. June 6, 1944. 0430 hours. Somewhere in occupied France, a Luftwaffe radio intercept team sat in a cold bunker near Calais. Cigarette smoke hung in thick ribbons under the ceiling lamps as three men huddled over their headsets, the static whispering like restless ghosts. Their charts and direction-finding instruments glowed faintly. The corporal on duty had been up since midnight, his logbook already full of Allied frequencies, chatter rising steadily from across the channel. He did not yet know it, but the most important invasion in modern history was unfolding 80 miles away, not in Calais, where his commanders expected it, but on the beaches of Normandy. And the reason he and his superiors were blind to it was because of a small farmhouse in Suffolk, England, where Thomas Reed and his team had, for weeks, built an empire of sound from nothing. By dawn on D-Day, Reed's operation was in full roar. The Ghost Net pulsed with deliberate urgency. Transmission schedules thickened, fake convoys were reported moving toward the coast, fabricated airfields buzzed with non-existent squadrons, and command nets throbbed with the kind of pressure that only happens before a major assault. Inside the farmhouse, it looked like chaos. Typewriters hammered reports that would never be read by any real officer. Ink-stained code sheets lay everywhere. Cigarette smoke curled in thick layers as operators shouted call signs across the room, creating the illusion of hundreds of units communicating. Alpha Niner to Fox Command. Fuel convoy delayed. Repeat, delayed. Delta 4 to Brigade HQ. LSTs forming up in convoy sequence, grid B7 to C3. Copy that, Alpha Niner, move vehicles to secondary assembly. Every word was theater. Every syllable a line in the greatest script of deception ever performed. Langley stood behind Reed, silent, listening to the crescendo. "They'll be moving now," he muttered, checking his watch. "Let's keep them focused east. Keep Calais alive." Across the English countryside, the illusion had grown enormous. From the sky, German reconnaissance planes saw what looked like a colossal army ready to cross the narrowest part of the channel. Rows of tanks, made of canvas and inflated rubber, glinting with painted metal. Landing craft, constructed from timber and canvas, resting on fake docks. Trucks and jeeps, just wooden shells with painted wheels, parked under camouflage nets. Campfires at night, lit by soldiers who were actors, technicians, or men from other units told to keep busy. And towering above it all in the German imagination was General George S. Patton, the most aggressive, unpredictable commander in the Allied arsenal. He was the perfect phantom general. His reputation alone was a weapon. For weeks, German intelligence had tracked supposed Patton sightings across southeastern England. Their spies, fed carefully through the British double-agent system known as the Double Cross, reported that Patton was assembling the First U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, a massive invasion force aimed squarely at Pas-de-Calais. The illusion was perfect because it fit what the Germans wanted to believe. Hitler himself had long been convinced that the real invasion would strike at Calais, the shortest crossing between England and France, and the most direct route to Germany. Every piece of Allied deception, every fake order, radio transmission, photo, and leak, fed that belief until it hardened into certainty. While real paratroopers dropped over Normandy in the pre-dawn darkness, Reed's men continued their ghost play. The radio room became a furnace of activity. Operators switched frequencies every few minutes, imitating a vast communications web, reports of supply trucks, air reconnaissance, even weather updates. At 0600, one of the younger operators, a 19-year-old woman from Manchester named Elsie Grant, keyed up a new net. Her task, simulate the chatter of a U.S. airborne division awaiting orders near Dover. She read from a typewritten script of plausible but meaningless data. Falcon 1 to Eagle Base, confirm Pathfinder beacon active. Repeat, Pathfinder beacon active. Awaiting green light. She repeated it twice, changing her inflection slightly each time, as though speaking from different aircraft. Then, she sent another short message about static line checks and drop altitudes. Those simple phrases, intercepted and logged by German listening posts, became proof that an airborne division was readying for an assault near Calais. By noon, Luftwaffe analysts had compiled over 60 pages of intercepted Allied transmissions, all pointing toward one conclusion: the invasion was coming to Calais. Meanwhile, on the real front, chaos reigned. In Normandy, American and British troops were fighting tooth and nail to establish their beachheads. But the German 15th Army, the powerful reserve force that could have crushed them, remained frozen near Calais, waiting for Patton's imaginary army to arrive. They waited one day. Then 2. Then a week. The German High Command hesitated to redeploy. Even as reports trickled in from Normandy describing the size of the landings, Hitler refused to believe that this was the real invasion. "The attack in Normandy is a diversion," he said on June 9, "the main blow will come at Calais." And so, entire armored divisions sat idle, their engines silent, because of voices Reed and his team had sent across the airwaves. In Suffolk, Reed could feel the weight of that deception like a stone in his chest. He knew every word he transmitted now helped keep those divisions pinned. By June 10, exhaustion had hollowed him. He had been awake nearly 48 hours, living on black tea and cigarettes, his voice rasping from hours of transmission. Langley finally ordered him to take a break. He stepped outside into the cold dawn. The countryside was silent, except for the distant hum of aircraft from nearby bases. Dew clung to the inflated tanks like silver frost. From afar, the fake army looked asleep, quiet, immense, and utterly convincing. A truck rolled past, its headlights doused. Inside were real soldiers, men bound for France. Reed watched them go, feeling the strange dissonance between his phantom war and their flesh-and-blood one. He had spent weeks pretending to be part of an army that didn't exist. Now he realized that his lies were giving the real men a chance to live. He returned to the farmhouse and keyed the mic once more. His hand trembled slightly. "Fusag command to all stations," he said. "Maintain readiness. Await further orders. No change in operational plan." Static hissed, long and low. And then, somewhere across the channel, German intelligence recorded that very transmission and filed it under confirmation of continued preparations for main assault, Pas de Calais. For another 2 weeks, Reed's ghost army remained alive. Even as the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, his team continued to simulate convoys, supply movements, and command chatter. They spoke of divisions that didn't exist, tanks that were never built, and officers who had never drawn breath. By the time the Germans realized the truth, it was far too late. The Allies had already broken through at Saint-Lô and begun the drive toward Paris. Operation Fortitude had worked. Not by guns or tanks or planes, but by sound, illusion, and nerve. In late July, when the order finally came to wind down operations, Reed sat in the empty farmhouse surrounded by silent radios. The room smelled of dust and burned circuits. The generator was off. He looked at his notebook, pages upon pages of call signs, phrases, and fake reports, the language of a war that never was. Langley came in quietly. "Well done, Corporal," he said. "You and your ghosts did your part." Reed smiled faintly, closing the notebook. "Strange, isn't it? To fight a war by pretending to fight one." Langley paused at the doorway. "That's the trick, son. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the loudest lies." Outside, the wind stirred the empty fields. The inflatable tanks lay deflated now, half buried in mud, the remains of an army that never existed. And somewhere in the archives of history, Thomas Reed's transmissions lived on, invisible echoes of a deception so perfect that it saved a continent.